Hi, all. Today I'll be discussing some key ideas from the philosopher Jürgen Habermas's essay, Philosophy as Standin and Interpreter. What is the role of philosophy after the decline of master discourses, after the rise of a variety of other disciplines, including all kinds of disciplines that study what philosophy used to study, including but not limited to sociology, psychology, anthropology, even all the natural sciences, which at one point were under the purview of philosophy. Philosophy used to be known as discipline that was the most important in figuring out how we understand the world. But we're living in a day and age, as Habermas points out, where philosophy's role is deeply uncertain. And some people actually think the discipline is outdated, should be done away with entirely. Habermas begins this essay by talking about how Immanuel Kant viewed the role of philosophy in the 18th century context of the rise of physics. So Kant, even a few hundred years ago, was wondering, what do we do with philosophy in a time when physics is really coming to the fore as a key way of understanding the world and using new methods in order to understand that disrupt traditional philosophical ones? As Habermas describes it, Kant considered two roles for philosophy. The first role for philosophy that Habermas finds in Kant is that of what he calls Usher, or Platzenweise in German, which is the language that Habermas is writing in. And he says that, according to Kant, it was philosophy's role to provide the foundation of the sciences, defining once and for all the limits of what can be experienced and what can't be experienced. He says that this is a way of showing the sciences to their proper place. Like, here's your seat, right? That's the role of usher. And Habermas says that a second role that he sees Kant advocating for philosophy is that of judge, where it's up to us philosophers to decide the boundaries between different disciplines, to say, hey, sociology, you're going to study human society and culture. Biology, you're going to study the nature of organic life, right? And here, philosophy specifically would be parceling out different areas of jurisdiction that belong to science, morality, and art. Habermas thinks that both of these roles for philosophy are pretty bad ones. And he engages with the work of American philosopher Richard Rorty here, who says that if these are bad roles for philosophy, philosophy should just give up the role of being the guardian of rationality altogether. And Habermas says, no. I agree with Rorty that the roles of usher and judge are bad for philosophy, but I'm not going to conclude that we should give up the role of being guardians of rationality altogether. Habermas also, and perhaps for our purposes more importantly, wants to reject the view that getting rid of philosophy as usher and judge means getting rid of philosophy altogether. In the face of the collapse of these two roles, along with the collapse of master thinkers, master narratives, and systems in the second half of the 20th century, many have rejected the claims of foundationalism that we find in Kant or absolutism that one finds in Hegel. There's been this kind of collapse, both within academia and outside of it, of trust in master narratives, and a move towards critical philosophy, philosophy that has more modest aims and tries to pick up the pieces after the collapse of master narratives. And Habermas thinks that in the wake of widespread belief that philosophy doesn't have a role to play, at least not an important role to play, there have been responses that he calls farewells to philosophy. And there have been a few primary forms of this. One is the therapeutic form of philosophy, where philosophy is supposed to consist in a kind of self-healing, but it is sick because it wastes its time on stupid questions, ridiculous abstract metaphysical questions that nobody could possibly answer. And it should give itself over to something like anthropology. This is a view that Habermas attributes to Wittgenstein. And the basic idea is that philosophy hasn't done enough to actually change the way we see the world, let alone change the world. So we should cure it of its ills. And that probably means not having philosophy anymore, because it's so irreparably damaged. The second farewell to philosophy that Habermas notes is what he calls the heroic farewell, which is the deconstruction of metaphysics and objectivating thought. The idea that philosophy needs to fundamentally be dismantled in its preconceptions, in its foundations. And he attributes this to people like Heidegger and Bataille. You might see this too in what sometimes is grouped under post-structuralist or postmodern philosophy. Habermas says that according to the heroic farewell to philosophy, the devalued and discredited philosophical tradition shouldn't be replaced by something even less valuable than itself, like other disciplines, but rather give way to a different medium altogether. And he gives Heidegger's being as an example of this, as well as Bataille's sovereignty. Now, the third type of farewell that Habermas sees people making to philosophy is the salvaging farewell, which tries to preserve philosophy as a kind of historical study. So it's like, oh, philosophy is this thing that humans used to do without trying to pretend like it's relevant for the present day. Or at the very least, not trying to pretend that its systematic claims are relevant for the present day. So the salvaging farewell, if it wants to maintain a role for philosophy, sees it as preserving philosophy as a body of texts that are able to illuminate and edify us, but that don't really contribute to the march of knowledge today. Habermas also, as you might imagine, doesn't think that these three farewells are really a great way of conceiving of philosophy, because Habermas wants to say that philosophy actually has a key role today, a key role to play today, right? And that role for him is not the role of usher and judge, as we've already said, but it's also not the role of philosophy having its own role that science can't co-opt because we're considering as philosophers things that go so far and above science that they're completely distinct from what science undertakes. He says that this kind of role wants to undertake a division of labor between the sciences and the humanities. And he associates this view with Richard Rorty, who says that when philosophy stops trying to problem solve, it can become an edifying discourse. And I want to just read for you a quick passage that Habermas writes here in describing Rorty, where he says that philosophy as a whole verges on edifying conversation once it has sloughed off all pretensions to problem solving. Such philosophical edification enjoys the benefits of all three types of farewell: therapeutic relief, heroic overcoming, and hermeneutic reawakening. It combines the inconspicuously subversive force of leisure with an elitist notion of creative linguistic imagination and with the wisdom of the ages. And this desire for edification is not the same as the desire for truth. Now, Habermas takes issue with this idea that he's just described as finding within Rorty. He also thinks it's true of existentialism, for what it's worth, right? Existentialism as this philosophy of freedom, of the kind of ungrounded ground of morality where we have to figure out what to do on the basis of impossible decisions. And he says that for him, right, for Habermas, there's actually only one criterion by which beliefs can be judged valid, and that is the space of communicative discourse. And so he rejects the idea that there is a division of labor between the humanities and the sciences, or between philosophy and the sciences. And communicative discourse for him is the way we reach agreement through argumentation. Both philosophy and the sciences rest on shaky ground because they rely on communicative discourse. And it's in that space of tension, of argument, that we actually are able to find truth. So there's not like one form of truth in the sciences and one form in philosophy. And it's also not the case that the sciences give us truth and philosophy just gives us meaning, right? He says, no, it's in this messy human space of trying to figure out truth together that both philosophy and the sciences work. So in light of this, Habermas proposes two new roles for philosophy, which are designated in the title of his essay. The first is Standin. or Platzhalter in German. So there's actually a play in German that you don't get in English between the role of usher, which he's rejected, that's Platzenweiser, and Standin, which he's proposing, which is Platzhalter, right? So you get the notion of Platz or place in both of them. So he says that to think about philosophy as a stand-in or placeholder, Platzhalter, means to think about it as a stand-in for the empirical sciences that have universalistic claims, but that haven't yet been able to defend those universalistic claims from a scientific perspective. He says that philosophy can furnish reconstructive hypotheses for use in empirical settings. We can hold the place for disciplines that want or need to make broad claims that they either can never defend because of the limits of their methods or can't yet defend because they haven't gotten the right data or they don't have the right instruments, right? And you might think about this, for instance, as actually having happened quite a bit in the history of philosophy. As one example, the notion of atoms existed way back in ancient Greek philosophy, long before humans discovered through the scientific method that atoms indeed are what make up the universe. And the same is true of a lot of ideas in quantum physics, especially around temporality as well. The second role that Habermas sees for philosophy is that of interpreter. And it's an interpreter on behalf of the life world, this rich, incredibly complex space of human collective existence within the environment that the sciences are in many ways ill-equipped to encapsulate. Not to mention, many humanities are also ill-equipped to encapsulate this in their inquiries. So he says that what philosophy can do is translate between the everyday life world and cultural modernity with its divvying up or siloing into different disciplines. And it can also translate between these various sectors. So philosophy is in a particularly good position, for instance, to be able to translate between physics and anthropology, or you see this a lot in contemporary studies of consciousness, between neuroscientific inquiries and those that have come from the history of philosophy itself, including phenomenology. Philosophy, he thinks, is an especially good communicator. And so we can interpret both between different disciplines and between the life world and the space of cultural modernity, or the disciplines that we find in contemporary academia. He says that if philosophy takes on the role of the interpreter, it might then be able to help set in motion the interplay between the cognitive instrumental, moral practical, and aesthetic expressive dimensions that has come to a standstill today like a tangled mobile. Habermas always one for text that's very laden with imagery. Hope you enjoyed this video and got a sense from this of what Habermas is up to in the text. Go ahead and read it if you haven't already.